Before we begin, a warning. This story isn't comfortable. It's not meant to be. What you're about to see isn't just about a man named George Wallace. It's about the South, about how we remember, and what we choose to forget. Wallace's name still divides dinner tables in hometowns across Alabama. Some remember him as the man who stood up to Washington. Others remember him as the man who stood in the schoolhouse door. But history isn't a monument. It's a mirror. And when we look into it, we don't always like what looks back. This episode of American Shadows isn't about rewriting history. It's about walking straight into it. The parts we still whisper about, the ghosts we still argue with, and the truth we still try to bury under the red clay. The South doesn't forget. It just decides what's worth remembering. And somewhere in that silence stands a locked museum in Clio, Alabama. I was allowed inside. But what I found there wasn't just a story about George Wallace. Across back roads and forgotten towns, the past lives on. Not in textbooks, but in weathered plaques, quiet museums, and the stories we nearly lost. I'm Pelham Pugh, and this is American Shadows, uncovering the people, places, and relics that shaped our American history. There's a building in Clio, Alabama, that history doesn't talk about anymore. The George C. Wallace Museum. Once, this was a monument, a shrine to a man who ruled Alabama politics for decades. Now, it's a tomb. Locked, dark, forgotten. But what's buried here isn't just his story. It's ours. George Corley Wallace was born here in Clio in 1919. A small-town boy from the red dirt fields of Barbour County, tough, smart, and hungry for power. He boxed for pocket change, studied law at the University of Alabama, and learned early how to read a crowd. Wallace wasn't the first Southern politician to flirt with racism, but he was the one who turned it into a campaign strategy. He understood the fear in people's hearts, and he knew how to sell it back to them as pride. When Wallace ran for governor in 1962, he lost to a candidate backed by the Ku Klux Klan. After that, he swore he'd never be out saying again, and he wasn't. A year later, he stood on the steps of the Alabama Capitol, raised his hand, and said words that would echo for generations.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
It was more than a slogan. It was a line drawn in concrete between Alabama and the rest of the world. The lights were off. The air hung heavy with dust and memory. Posters from his campaigns curled at the edges. Buttons, bumper stickers, and yellow newspaper clippings filled the glass cases. Snapshots from a time when Wallace's name could electrify a crowd. There are photographs of him shaking hands with presidents, smiling beside his wife, Merling, standing on courthouse steps before he see microphones. All of it preserved, not in pride exactly, but in paralysis. A history too heavy to throw away, yet too painful to display proudly. Standing there, it didn't feel like a museum. It felt like Alabama trying to decide whether to remember or forget. For decades, Alabama told the story of George Wallace like he was a folk hero, the man who stood up to Washington, the governor who never backed down. But behind the mythology was something darker, a truth we didn't want to face. Wallace didn't speak for the South. He spoke to its fears. catching up. In 1972, while running for president, Wallace was shot in Maryland. The bullet paralyzed him from the waist down. The man who had built his power on strength and defiance now faced the rest of his life in a wheelchair, and it changed him. Or at least, that's what he said. Wallace began visiting black churches. He asked for forgiveness. He told his followers that he'd been wrong. To some, it was redemption. To others, just politics. One last campaign for sympathy. Maybe both were true. Because redemption is easy to talk about when the crowd's already going home. As I walked those empty halls, I realized this museum didn't close by accident. It closed because we didn't know what to do with him, or with ourselves. You can't celebrate a man who stood in the schoolhouse door, but you can't quite erase the part of Alabama that still remembers him fondly. So instead, we lock the door, and we walk away. Every artifact in that building tells a story that we're afraid to finish. A governor's pen, a campaign hat, a Bible open to the book of Job. They sit frozen somewhere between reverence and regret, between the man Alabama loved and the truth Alabama ignored. We like to tell ourselves that Wallace changed, that time healed wounds, that Alabama moved on. But maybe we didn't. Maybe the museum closed because we're still not ready to look in the mirror. Because what Wallace really represented wasn't just segregation. It was the comfort of denial, the easy lie that said we were right all along. And even now, you can still hear that echo every time someone says, "That's just how it was back then." As if time makes hate acceptable, as if history absolves us for refusing to learn from it. Clio is a quiet town now, a crossroads, a few stores, and that locked museum tucked away in the kudzu. But the ghosts here don't rest easy. They linger in the dust, in the woods, in the silence of what we don't say. And they whisper a question that still hangs over this state. Not who was George Wallace, but who are we that we made him? Maybe that's why this place stands empty. Not because we've forgotten him, but because we remember him too well. And remembering means admitting what we let happen. The crowd that cheered, the voters who believed, the people who stayed quiet. Maybe we closed the museum to keep the ghosts locked inside, but ghosts don't need doors. They just need silence. And we've given them plenty of that. Standing outside, I stared at the locked door and looked back at the withered sign. The paint cracked and faded, the letters barely hanging on. And I thought about how Alabama still carries his shadow. Maybe the story of George Wallace isn't about politics or power. Maybe it's about how a man can spend his life dividing people and still be remembered by some as a savior. Maybe it's about how easy it is for pride to wear the mask of righteousness. Or maybe it's about how truth always outlives the lies we tell to protect it. I'm Pelham Pugh, and this is American Shadows. The South remembers what it wants to remember, but history doesn't stay buried forever. My novel, Perfidious Tides, explores that same struggle. What we inherit, what we hide, and what refuses to stay gone. It hit #1 in Nor Crime on Amazon, and you can find it, along with more stories like this, at pelhampugh.com. Thanks for walking through the silence with me, because sometimes the things we lock away tell the loudest truths.